I like hearing what these other people are saying because it gets me thinking about stuff. And then, so that was my 2 cents worth. I had something else I listened to that had to do with the dangerous method, and I think what it made me do was go look up Speilrein. And actually I was looking for Speilrein when I found this other stuff. But she was quite a force. I didn't realize she was that powerful. But she came up with sort of a solution to Jung's. Jung's talking about, the sexual drive and how you seek pleasure and you won't release and this sort of thing. And so nobody could figure out, well, if that's the case, why do we keep trying to push it away from us? Why don't we just embrace it and go, wow, man, this is great.
Yeah.
And Speilrein came up with a solution. She said sex doesn't have to do, it's not so much about pleasure and release, it's about fusion. The idea that you become something larger. You become part of something larger.
Right.
Yeah. Well, she influenced Piaget as well as Melanie. I don't know how to say her last name. Klein. I just say Klein. But what she did was she said the reason the ego resists the unconscious is because the ego has to give itself to the fusion, has to become part of the, she says the sexual energy drives the unconscious. So when the ego becomes part of the fusion of sex, it has to release, you have to let go of the ego. And so if you think about it in a way, if the ego doesn't want to let go of the control and the individuation or the individuality, then there's a tension between the unconscious and the conscious, because the conscious is driven by the ego.
But you're saying that's the healthy way is to aspire to this fusion, right? This is the healthy state?
No, I'm just saying that's what Speilrein said.
Oh,
right.
It's like I took philosophy. I never agreed or disagreed with anyone. I just said, this is what so-and-so said, this is what this guy said, and it either works or it doesn't work. She became more Freudian. She lined up with Freud and then fixed him, fixed his theory. Yeah. And she sort of left Jung. And what she was doing was she was trying to get the two old codgers to come back together. I got the sense that she didn't care so much who owned. I don't know that she was well enough known to have been that big an influence. Well, that's like saying, well, Dylan was the prophet of the age. Well, Dylan wasn't consciously the prophet of anything, but he turned out to be the prophet by channeling that stuff. So she channeled the 60s maybe, but she didn't.
I don't think anybody in the 60s or 70s ever heard of Sabina Speilrein at that time. But her thinking was out there.
She was channeling the 60s.
She was channeling it, yes. Like Nietzsche, 40, 50 years before Jung started writing, Nietzsche was writing Thus Spake Zarathustra. I actually brought all of you a copy of the article. It's called We've Had 100 Years of Psychotherapy, and
I've read this,
things are worse.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not...
I haven't read it in a good 20 years.
Oh, this is Hillman?
Yeah.
30 years ago.
Hillman and somebody else.
Hillman is awesome.
Hillman is awesome. This...
especially those 3 books in the 70s.
Yeah, The Blue Fire and...
Well, Revisioning Psychology.
Yes.
Then the one about the dreams, Night something. And I can't remember the third one. But there's 3 of them that came out right one after the other.
Right.
But Revisioning Psychology is... That for me, that one set the bar for me.
Well, Hillman was extremely influential because he had been, believe it or not, he was the dean of the faculty of the Jung Institute for about 10 years during the 1950s, up until Jung's death, and I think he moved on.
That was Jung Institute in this country?
No, in Zurich.
Okay.
The original Jung Institute. And he'd been a very interesting character, and there's actually a 2-volume biography of James Hillman that's being written. The first volume is out. I've listened to it on Audible, and it's amazing. what his life was like. Because, for example, he's born into this family that owned some famous hotel in Atlantic City, and it was a Jewish family, and so when he was growing up as a boy, he was into all the guts of the hotel, the laundry and all the other stuff, and so the book about the first volume of his biography is really a well-written book. I can highly recommend it. It's very interesting. And but then he and his wife of the time, I'm not sure he stayed with her, but anyway, they went to India, and they were living up in the mountains in northern India for at least 1 or 2 years, and then they were, I don't know, Africa or South America someplace, and somehow they sort of stumbled on Jung and then never left. and so he was, I don't know, he was like in his early 20s when he met Jung, who was in his 80s, and in that book there's an interesting description of the first time they met and how moving it was for him.
Well, this author describes Hillman as an apostate.
As a what?
An apostate of Jung's, because he brought in the idea of polytheism.
Yeah.
And
well.
If I'm not confusing
Jung
something.
isn't that a slam?
Yeah, I mean, when I read this book I have it at home, and I read it about a year ago, or 2 years ago maybe, and when I read it, I had an attitude about it. I admit I had an attitude, and the attitude was, okay, here's a guy that's trying to lay on Jung again mysticism, okay, and that's not what Jung was about at all. And in fact, his whole career was debunking mystical practices.
Well, I think what he's saying is that wasn't. I don't think he would disagree with you, but he was saying that in secret, in his own private space, Jung was developing all these mystical kind of approaches.
Well,
he had the castle.
Right. Remember what I think I said it last week, where Jung was always saying he never said anything about the metaphysical God. I don't say anything about the metaphysical God because that's for religion to say. I'm only telling you what I find empirically. These are facts. And the trouble is, everything about the psyche is metaphysical.
But see,
well, they are psychic facts.
My understanding of this guy was he was trying to debunk Jung. He was trying to put Jung down.
Right.
I didn't get that feeling at all. I thought there was a lot.
Well, I haven't read it. This is
for
from like almost 20 years ago.
So when you made your comment to me about it, I pulled it out again to look at it about the Red Book, because you'd made some comment. Do you have the reference where you were looking?
Well, he said the Red Book was heavily influenced by Nietzsche's ideas. In terms of
have you read the Red Book?
The language, the more prosaic language that Nietzsche used was kind of like.
That's.
But see, that's lining up on a side, because there's a lot of people that didn't like Nietzsche either, and it's sort of like if you can put all these people in a row, and then you go, well, see, because I mean, especially like the Kantians and maybe even the Hegelians. A lot of those guys didn't like Nietzsche at all, because Nietzsche was not systematic and structured. He was more like a poet.
Well, and he had a very thin transcendent function.
Okay,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, he had
he vaporized, right?
He had a thin veil between his conscious and his unconscious minds.
Yeah.
But you wanted the reference to the Red Book
Well, the passage where you were saying that they were shocked or something.
Yeah.
You said
at
they were.
one point, this was 19. After Jung's death, this is a long passage, is that all right?
Yeah, but
His son Franz took over running the house at Kuznach.
Right.
As Jung had left no instructions about the Red Book, Franz left it in the cupboard where Jung put it.
right,
By many accounts, Franz's attitude toward the book was somewhat less appreciative than that of its new readers, and the family's attitude in general toward pilgrims in search of a glimpse of the mystical tome was, at least according to the Red Book's editor, Sonu Shamdasani,
Sono Shamdasani, yeah,
get lost.
right,
The Red Book has been advertised as being seen until now by only a handful of people outside the Jung clan. As synchronicity would have it, I met one of those shortly before the book's UK publication. David Trezner, author among other books of Star Wisdom and Rudolf Steiner, remembers visiting Kuznach as a psychology graduate student during a seminar on Jung and Hermann Hesse in 1971. At one point, Franz Jung unlocked some kind of door or cabinet, produced with a flourish what he called the Red Book. The students asked if they could open it, and Franz said, "Sure, I don't care." There ensued, and this is a quote, "There ensued an odd combination of behavior," Tresmer told me in an email. Some people pored over these pages and whispered to each other, while Jung's son made comments that were slighting of Jung, more than a little too loud, trying to ignore the marvel in front of him. I was most impressed by the juxtaposition of disdain and awe in the room.
Well, I think there is a juxtaposition of disdain and awe, but the awe is taking over since 2009, definitely. I mean, here's the reality. The people that were closest to Jung knew about the Red Book. It was on his desk for 30 years, okay? And he was referring to it among his closest apostles for many years. So
He was using it in therapy as well.
And he was using it in therapy, and he was learning himself about himself by doing these practices. And so we have to remember that there was no psychology before Freud and Jung, really. I mean, there was laying on of hands and mesmerization and hypnotism and various other stuff, but nobody had really made psychology into a science before Freud came along, and Freud got hung up on sex as the thing, and the fundamental falling out between the two was that they didn't agree on that. That Jung said there's a lot more to it, man, than just sex. We have a lot of other things going on here, and so who knows? But I think that the people that were closest to Jung in the first generation of apostles were well versed in the Red Book. Now, I don't deny that in a circumstance like that, I did read that passage the other day, and I wasn't connecting that up to what you had said to me in the email, but sure. I mean, if you had 10 years after Jung's death, if you have a bunch of people come in on a Jung conference and they get a chance to look at the Red Book, obviously there's going to be, and it's only for a few minutes or an hour even, or however long Franz left it out. Obviously there would be a lot of discussion about it. They've never seen it. A lot of them probably didn't know it existed by then, 10 years after Jung's death. And so, Shamdasani, to his great credit, became, he just made his life into being the expert on the life of Carl Jung and on the work of Carl Jung. That's what he's done. And, he's the professor of Jungian history at King's College in London or something like that. And what he did, which is I think explained in that book is that he went to the heirs and he said, look, there are mimeos of this material out there, and he had found some in the Yale Library in the rare books department, and so he went to France and some others and said, look, this is going to come out, we're going to publish it one way or another, and wouldn't it be good if we did an excellent folio version of this book? And that's what he did. It took him 13 years to publish it.
Can it be procured now, or is it out of print?
You can get it for about $150 on Amazon.
Was it something that Jung created over a period of time and then that was the end of it? And then he kept using it, or did he keep developing it? Because it can't be that big, right?
Well, it's 200 pages of German calligraphy in big pages. I mean, he was doing the calligraphy in the style of the ancient monks, medieval monks, and he believed that by
Doesn't that make him a mystic right there?
yeah, arguably. I
Well,
mean,
there's nothing wrong with being a mystic. My understanding of that guy was he was putting down being. Yeah. I just understood he was trying to make. This is also remembering from a long time ago, but he was trying to make who I was reading a review of said he was trying to make Jung seem less important because he wasn't scientific.
which is
At all.
Well,
You know what?
Because he himself is interested in mystical.
Okay.
yeah, he's interested
Maybe
in
it's
mystical
also another
things.
book.
But I don't. I personally don't think that Jung actually went into mysticism per se. I mean, what the answer to your question is, or your question, is that in 1928 he'd been working on this thing for 14 years or something like that. I mean, he was just trying to get a grasp on it. So he's evolving himself, trying to understand what's going on in his own psyche, and so some of his early work is a little bit weird. I mean, the seven sermons are strange, but they were active imaginations. That's what he came to understand them as. But he published them too early because he had those experiences in the 19-teens.
I thought he only gave those to certain friends.
Well, he did. But he did a small publication of them, and so it got out, and he published maybe a couple hundred copies or something, a small off print, and because that's what they were doing back then. They didn't have all this wonderful gear that we have today. And
so he moved into other books then after the Red Book, is that right?
Oh yes, the Red Book.
Why did they just print the Red Book then, or did they print others?
It was his own personal diary almost.
Yeah, it was a diary of his psychic development.
But you know how some people will have a book where they put their special stuff. Well, he had written all this stuff in those black books, and so they were just like, those were like diaries. And then he'd take it and transformed it into this, precious document for him.
Right.
And he didn't really expect anyone else to see it. It was his
Religion or something.
Yeah,
it was kind of his process of how he got his own psyche.
I can't think of the word at the moment, but it was
access to his own unconscious.
Right, exactly.
He made it precious to himself by encasing it in this beautiful, document.
So if he put together books after the Red Book, wasn't that a continuation, and it was those other books were his personal development?
No. I mean, what he says about the Red Book is that that's the prima materia of his whole life. Okay, that was the primary experiences, his
That's
personal
where all
experiences.
the things came together for him.
Right.
That was where
And
he
then
was
from
having
that,
crisis.
But he didn't have his arms around it.
Yeah.
Okay, and he things were happening to him in his psyche. He didn't know how to deal with it. Okay, and so he kept working on it for all these years, 16 years. And then in 1928, Richard Wilhelm came to him with a translation of the Tao Te Ching. And he asked Jung to do a foreword to the Tao Te Ching. And it's called The Secret of the Golden Flower. Okay, and so his forward is the first time that you're actually finding, and this is 28 or 29, you're actually finding him in one 60-page thing saying what his psychology is about. Okay, it's in the Dropbox. You can just download it and read it. But it was then he had been also sort of getting into alchemy, because he'd run into all these symbols in alchemy. He was starting to understand that symbols were very important in the unconscious, and that they produce some result, some solution. And so the main symbols of the main religions fall into this category, but many others, right? And so, I mean, just because Christ died on the cross, that wasn't the beginning of crosses in human history. They went way back before that, thousands of years. And actually, it was Isis who had the first virgin birth. It wasn't the Virgin Mary at all, about 1,000 years earlier in Egypt. So those ideas were already percolating around in society. And so, but when Wilhelm brought him the Tao Te Ching and he read it, he suddenly realized that there's a confirmation that alchemy is important, because that was an alchemical text. And it was Lao Tzu talking in a organized way about alchemy, basically Chinese alchemy. And so it was at that time that the penny dropped, and he realized that alchemy, what the alchemists were up to, and what it was really all about. And so then he spent the next 30 years talking about alchemy.
Yeah, this book says that actually Jung was trying to fit his theory around alchemy, and that professional alchemic historians thought he was that he was just manipulating his alchemy to make it look like it was universally his theory as well, that it matched. And that he did that with other things as well.
Well, I mean, I don't think he was inventing.
He did
Sounds more like Freud.
Although he did say that it's a good match psychologically. He said that the historians debunked that.
Well, he wasn't trying to steal what the alchemists had done. I mean, he spent 10 years coming up with a glossary of alchemical terms. He came up with this glossary.
What I was saying was that this author was saying that he said, "Oh, alchemists were doing what I've been developing," and he's saying that's not what the historians said.
Yeah, that's not what
I've never seen that.
No, because
to me,
you read.
he was like looking for revelations, and so he wasn't looking to be I didn't see him trying to contain
Make
whole
an
philosophies in his, as if he had thought of it independently or anything.
Well, and he even said when he was 80 years old, the videos on YouTube, tell them that I'm not settled yet. People want an organized Jungian presentation, and I'm not ready.
Well, that's one thing that's impressed me about Jung, actually reading Jung, is he has a humility about him.
Oh,
that's
yeah.
admirable.
Right. And
with his stature, that's a pretty amazing thing. Really.
Yeah, and I mean, you probably saw it in some of these early works you looked at, but when you get into psychology and alchemy, oh my God, that's a history of the human mind. You can find no history book about historical events that's more scholarly in terms of the presentation, in terms of the footnoting. I mean, it's just...
But be warned, if you read that, you'll want to go read all the all the stuff that that feeds into it or is fed out of it.
Sure.
I mean, it's just like it's vast. That's how I got interested in astrology.
Sure.
Because of the connections between once you start seeing the language of the cosmos, the planets, the way they describe relationships. The sulfur is related to this planet. So when you're reading the original alchemical texts and stuff, they're not exactly prose you're familiar with, and in fact they're often coded.
Yeah, I mean, those guys were afraid that they were going to be burned at the stake, basically, the alchemists.
And where did they practice?
They practiced
Western
in
Europe?
court, yeah. But they were also in the Arab world. There were alchemists in Morocco and Algeria, in Egypt.
Did they have secret labs and things? Or difference?
So they had this cover that they were trying to see if they could make things into gold, but that isn't what they were doing. Okay, so alchemists are credited with being precursors to modern chemistry, but yeah, they were, and they were doing things, but by the process of what they were doing, something like what Jung was doing with the Red Book, they were following a process trying to test different theories, and yes, they were getting chemical reactions, I think, and results. They weren't getting gold, although
but they were getting lots of metaphors and allegories.
Right. Yeah, and so it was just because it was such solitary work. There weren't crowds sitting around watching the alchemists do this stuff.
When are you coming out with the next one?
Right.
Were they a fringe group then?
I don't think they were fringe. I think some of them were in the courts. I mean, you remember Merlin the magician, right? And you know who Merlin is, right?
No.
Merlin is the child of Satan and a pure virgin. That's who he was.
What?
Merlin,
Yeah.
the magician,
As opposed to an impure version.
right, was the child. I think I have this right, but it's something like this. Merlin was the child of Satan and a pure virgin.
Well,
But-
it's also one variation. It's
Right.
like every one of these myths and everything else you hear. There's so many variations.
Right,
that come up
exactly.
to us.
But when Jung carved his stone at age 75, okay, he put Greek sayings and different messages on the sides. Jung said about his stone that he was going to carve on the backside of the stone the cry of Merlin. Okay, and the cry of Merlin is, a myth that if you're out in the forest, you hear these cries of type stuff, and it's Merlin crying in the dark.
You know what?
No, go ahead.
Well, I can't remember her name. What? She trapped him in a crystal mountain. What was her name?
It's his fault for
Morgana or
walking
something
into
like
it.
that, or
Yeah.
Morgana,
Yeah, that's it. Morgana.
right?